This is a 7th, if you will, installment of Eschatology. And then she starts, huh? Well, let's pick up some of our review here. And pick up the greater context. I've done this almost every time, but the greater context was, this was spoken of in the Old Covenant, that the day of the Lord was going to come, that there's going to be judgment, that the stars would fall from the sky, the moon would not give forth its light, the sun would be darkened. We saw this language throughout the Old Covenant. Then we saw Malachi, which was the last book of the Old Covenant, mentions it, and it says before that day would come Elijah. And Jesus, when he comes, he says John the Baptist is that Elijah. When John the Baptist shows up, y'all remember what he was preaching? He was saying, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? What's he talking about? The day of the Lord, the end of the Jewish age. That destruction of the temple and the city. He was saying, who warned you to flee from this wrath? And then he told him, the axe is laid at the root of the tree. Remember, we dealt with that. And the axe being the Romans, and the tree being the Jewish leaders. So that's our greater context of the history of this. And in Matthew 23, before we jumped into Matthew 24, we dealt with Matthew 23 where Jesus was there at the temple. And he was rebuking the Jewish leaders at that time, the Pharisees and Sadducees. And he tells them that their house is left desolate. And all the blood of all the righteous was going to come upon this generation, is what he said. And then we get to, then he leaves the temple, he departs the temple, heads east to Mount Olive. Just like God did in the Old Covenant when he left the temple, the first temple, he headed east and sat on Mount Olive and then destroyed the temple. He's doing the same thing this time. And when he's leaving the temple and headed east, his disciples say, but pretty much, Jesus, but look at the temple, how great the temple is and all its buildings. And Jesus says, not one stone will be left upon another. We saw the historical significance of that. And then Josephus, how he wrote that if you would have walked up to the temple in 71 AD, he didn't say 71, but after it happened, you wouldn't even have known that it had ever been inhabited. There's not one stone left upon another. So it happened exactly like Jesus said. We went through all the 7 different things, signs, if you will. The false Christ, we saw the false Christ. We saw wars and rumors of wars. There was literally a book written in the first century called The War of the Jews. And if you remember, the context there was they were in what was called a Pax Romana, the Roman peace. So there wasn't wars and rumors of wars. So when Jesus was saying this, it would have been like, well, that doesn't make sense because everybody's at peace with Rome. But Jesus said it happened. You had natural disasters, you had earthquakes, and you had pestilence, famine. We saw all that. Persecutions. I think anybody reading the New Testament, if they don't come away with that the early church was persecuted, they ain't reading very good because it's all over the place. Apostasy. We saw that. And actually, like the whole book of Hebrews was about apostasy. It was about people coming into the church, partaking of the gifts that we have, our communion, the preaching, the fellowship, and then leaving and going back into Judaism. So the whole book's telling you, don't do that. And then it says, we're not of those that have drawn back into perdition. So we see the apostasy. We saw the worldwide evangelism. Now this is one that a lot of people can accept all these other ones, right? The apostasy, persecutions, we see all this stuff. The worldwide evangelism, sometimes people don't really want to accept that this happened. But Jesus said that the gospel is going to be preached in this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. And we saw that Paul said in Colossians chapter 1 that the gospel had been preached to every creature under heaven. he says in Romans chapter 1 that your faith is being spoken of throughout the whole world. So that happened in that first century. Before 70 AD, because like I mentioned before, Paul died under the hand of Nero. Nero wasn't alive at 70 AD. So the Apostle Paul, who wrote those things, died before 70 AD. So the gospel went forth into all the nations, into the whole world. It did go forth into them. We saw the abomination of desolation and how it was the Roman armies was the abomination of desolation. Not one guy that pops up that's supposedly this Antichrist, but it was the Roman armies that were going to come. And Jesus says about that, he tells them that when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel's prophet standing in the holy place, then let them which are in Judea flee into the mountains. And I don't know if y'all remember, you would think by that time it'd be too late. Jesus tells them, when you see this, then flee. You would think, well, Jesus, tell me what's going to happen before he shows up, or this abomination of desolation, what you're talking about. Tell me what's going to happen before that so I can flee before they show up. But we know historically that the Roman armies came and surrounded the city, and it said that they could have besieged the whole city. They could have destroyed the whole city, but they didn't, and they backed away for a few months. And when they backed away, the Christians fled to Pella. And it was actually written that no Christians died during that. What I call the tribulation. I think that's where it was. That 3.5 years there from 66 to 70 AD was the 3.5 year tribulation period. And the Christians got to flee and got out of it. Now let's look down at verse 32. We'll read, verse 29. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened. This is Matthew 24, Matthew 24, 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So let me preface this by saying there's no way I'm going to cover everything there is to cover about the coming of the Lord. I don't think I exhaustively covered anything that we've talked about so far, and I won't exhaustively cover this. I would like to, and maybe leading on later we can cover it more exhaustively, but it's one thing that there's no way I'm going to be able to cover it in one message. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to cover everything I have in my notes in one message, let alone everything about the day or the coming of the Lord in one message. But the first thing I want to look at is the time frame. The time frame of the coming of the Lord. So in verse 29 and 30, it speaks of this. It says, the first word in verse 29 is immediately after the tribulation. So what do we have is the abomination of desolation shows up. The Christians flee. They start destroying the city, right? This is called the tribulation period. John says he was a partaker in it in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 9. He says, I'm your fellow partaker in the tribulation. He says the tribulation. So it was actually happening right then. When John was writing Revelation, the tribulation was happening. And what does he write a Revelation about? The same thing Matthew 24. Get out. Get out of here. Get out of Jerusalem. Get out. It's about to be destroyed. The day of the Lord's coming. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, John says he is a part of it. It is spoken of by Jesus as happening after the abomination of desolation, which we saw was a Roman army standing in the holy place in Jerusalem. They were to flee Judea, and they did, as we saw. They fled to Pella, and what was said And was said that no Christians died in the tribulation. The tribulation took place then immediately after verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. We dealt with this language here before. We've dealt with it a couple times actually. But we know that verse 29 was common language throughout the Old Testament of when God would show up to destroy a nation. If God was about to judge a nation, going to destroy a nation, this is the language that's used about it. And it's not literally the stars are going to fall. It's not literally the sun was going to be darkened. It was what they call cosmic deconstruction language. Instead of creation or decreation language. Instead of creation, there's a decreation. God's destroying something. So he uses this type of language. And you can easily go back into the Old Covenant and see this over and over and over again. So it's, to our minds, unfortunately we come in, we're New Testament, under the New Covenant, we're Gentiles, we're raised not like the Jews were raised. We're raised on television and TV dinners, right? And then the Lord saves us, when we're 19, 20 years old, and then we start digging into the New Testament and we see this language and we're like, that's the end of the world. But the Jewish mind knows, no, God's always been using that language. And he uses it on the destruction of a nation. So it wasn't out of the ordinary for Jesus to use that. And remember, this is still under the Old Covenant. Matthew 24 is still, the Old Covenant is still in force. So he was speaking under the Old Covenant dispensation. It's still the Old Covenant, and he was the last prophet, as the writer of Hebrews states. He says, God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. In these last days, what's the last days of? The writer of Hebrews, he says, in these last days, he's spoken to us about us by his Son. The last days were the last days of the Old Covenant. The writer of Hebrews, when he's writing the Old Covenant, people were still practicing the Old Covenant. The temple was still standing, right? So they were still going in there, they were still making sacrifices, but he says, in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. The writer of Hebrews later on talks about the law vanishing away. It hadn't vanished away yet, it was vanishing away. So it was the last days of the Old Covenant. And we've already dealt with this too, but the end of the age, or the last days, was the last days of the Old Covenant. It was the end of the Jewish age. And I'm telling you, when you grasp this, when you come to the text, when you grasp that when it talks about the end of the age or the last days, we understand that it's talking about the end of the Old Covenant, not necessarily the end of the world. It makes a lot more scripture make sense. So the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give us light, and the stars will fall from the heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then, verse 30, and then shall appear the sign. The sign of the Son of Man in heaven. What version do you have?
NIV.
What version do you have over there? Can you read yours?
Verse 30?
Yeah.
And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky.
Okay, you stop. You know there's a difference right there?
KJV says heaven.
Yeah. Well, I got KJV today too. I think ESV has the words flipped too. It's a sign in the sky of the Son of Man. It says, that's a big difference, right? What's the NIV say?
Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven.
See, this is what I just said, right? Mm-hmm. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. I think there's the way these translations flip the words around can confuse some. The NIV actually does. I had put it in there, I forgot. It says, then will appear in heaven the sign. And it's of the Son of Man. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. The NASB says, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in the sky. And the KJV says, then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. So now obviously you're like, so? Well, let me break this down. There's a sign of the Son of Man in heaven. The Son of Man wasn't necessarily the sign. It wasn't the sign that's of the Son of Man. It was a sign that the Son of Man was in heaven. That's what it's saying. Like, it didn't mean that people were going to see Jesus in the sky. That's not what this is saying. It means that there was a sign that signified that the Son of Man was in heaven. And what was this sign? The destruction of the city and the temple. There's your sign. Daniel chapter 7, I don't know if we should go there, but it talks about the Son of Man being taken up into the clouds. I believe this is talking about his ascension there in Daniel chapter 7. He goes up into the clouds. He's presented before the Ancient of Days, right? At his ascension. And the sign that he's there, that he's sitting there, when Jesus says, you will see me coming in clouds. The sign that he was in heaven, that what he said was true, was that the temple and the city was about to be destroyed. And when it did get destroyed, we know he's who he said he was, right? David Chilton says about this. The divinely ordained cataclysm of AD 70 revealed that Christ had taken the kingdom from Israel and given it to the church. The desolation of the old temple was the final sign that God had deserted it and was now dwelling in a new temple of the church. John Gill, who, if me and John Gill, which we will someday probably, sit down and talk some eschatology. But I don't think we would agree on 100% of things. I look at John Gill and about every single verse I look at in the Bible. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't, but he's very wise.
I'd argue that by the time you sit down with it, you would
I know.
agree on everything.
Yeah, we would. But we can still sit down and talk like, you remember you wrote this, John? You were wrong. But no, listen to this. He says, it may be observed that the other evangelists make no mention of the sign, only speak of the Son of Man, Mark 13:26. And he shall appear not in person, but in the power of his wrath and vengeance on the Jewish nation, which will be a full sign and proof of his being come. For the sense is that when the above calamity shall be upon the civil state of that people, and there will be such changes in their ecclesiastical state, it will be a clear point that Christ is come in the flesh, and that he is also come in his vengeance on that nation for the rejection and crucifixion of him, as if they had seen him appear in person in the heavens. They had always been seeking a sign and were continually asking of one, and now they will have a sign and a witness, as they had accordingly. So Gil's pretty much saying, the Jews always were seeking a sign, and that was their sign. The sign is the temple's gone, the city's destroyed. There's your sign. You thought the Son of Man didn't come down from God. He didn't descend before he ascended. Now you have proof. He ascended back to the Father. He sat down on his right hand, and there's your sign. Your city's gone, and your house is left to you desolate. So, for 3.5 years, there had been a tribulation that was spoken of by Daniel. He says times, and half a time. That's 3.5 years, that tribulation period. It's actually repeated by John in Revelation chapter 11. He says, and it was given unto the Gentiles for 42 months to trample the city. So for 42 months they trampled the city. And here's the sign. The city is lit on fire, and the temple was being destroyed. So go back to our text here. It says, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn. And they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Does this remind you of anything else Jesus said here? And they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and great glory. Turn up maybe one page, Matthew 26. in verse 63. Maybe 2 pages. But Jesus held his peace. That means he didn't speak. What does that remind you of? Isaiah 53? But Jesus held his peace, and the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus saith unto him, Thou hast said it. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Same language right there, right? That Jesus saying to the high priest, you're going to see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. You shall see it. That's what he says, right? You shall see it, high priest. That's the ones that was there. So was Jesus correct about that when he said they will see it? What about in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7? Actually, let's turn over there. Chapter 1, verse 7. Will you read this?
Behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him. Even so, amen.
Does that not sound exactly like what he just said in Matthew 24? And then to follow it up, what he says to the high priest, you shall see me coming in the clouds. But in verse 7 it says, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth. Now, earth there is Gi, which is land. Well, I think that's how it should be translated, talking about the land of Israel. So even those that pierced him. So did they see him? Jesus said, you will see me. John says, well, this is actually John writing here. But John says that even the ones that pierced him will see him. So are they both wrong? Or did they actually see him? And actually, let's remember the context of this. Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. He says, it was unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass. This stuff was going to shortly come to pass. In verse 3, what does he say? He says, the time is near, or the time is at hand, of what? Of this book that he's writing. This revelation of Jesus Christ that is given to John to send forth to the churches. The time is near, the time is at hand, it must shortly take place. And in verse 7, those that pierced him will see it.
And even that Revelation 1:7, it shows Daniel 7:13.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's what he's quoting from. When Jesus speaks about the Son of Man, that's where the Jewish mind would go to Daniel, because it was the Son of Man that was presented to the Ancient of Days, and he come in the clouds. That was, I believe, his ascension. So by the time that John wrote Revelation, the time of this coming was very near. Very near. Is at hand. Remember, he also closes the book in the same fashion. In Revelation 22 and verse 6, it says, it must shortly be done. In verse 7, Jesus says, I come quickly. And in verse 10, he says, the time is at hand, seal not up the prophecy. The opposite of what he says in Daniel. Daniel says, in Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, he says, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even unto the time of the end. So they tell Daniel to seal the book until the time of the end. Then you get to Revelation, he says, do not seal the book. Why? Because it's the time of the end. The book is left unsealed. And then in chapter 22 and verse 12, Jesus says again, I come quickly. Now you may have heard of this language, this imminent return of Christ? Y'all familiar with that? That saying, the imminent return of Christ? I've heard my whole Christian life is this imminent return of Christ, that it could happen at any second. That just keep a lookout. It can happen right now. The reason that we have that language, the imminent return of Christ, is because of the language of the new covenant. That is soon. It's going to come quickly. It's at hand. It's ready to take place. It's going to happen now. It's coming to pass. So Jesus said it was be soon, quick, at hand, and near, which means it was imminent. It was imminent, right? It was imminent when these writers were writing this. So, but typically the people that use that language of the imminent return of Christ are saying it's about to happen now. Any day now. Any day now. We're in the end times. Hey brother, we're in the end times. Any day now. The rapture is about to happen. Christ is coming back. It's imminent, right? It's been 2,000 years. That don't seem imminent to me. Been 2,000 years, but any day now Jesus will come back. That's not what the disciples thought when they wrote. It was about to happen. It was soon. But that's when they wrote. They were saying it's about to happen. It's about to happen. It's not what Jesus said when he said this generation will not pass until all these things take place in Matthew 24. He said this generation, not that generation, not some far out generation, but this particular generation, the same generation that he mentions in chapter 23, that he says all the blood of the prophets will come upon this generation. That same generation in Matthew 23 was the same generation in Matthew 24. And it was that first century generation. So Jesus said, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. He says that after verse 30. After he says he's coming, he says all these things will take place. So it was imminent to the first century writer before 70 AD. And the sign was the destruction of the holy city and her temple. Let's turn and see something else about this. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew 10:23. Remember, we're dealing with time frame. The time frame of his coming. Matthew 10:23. Says, but when they persecute you in this city, flee ye into another. For verily I say unto you, you shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come. He says, you shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come. The Son of Man in Daniel 7:13. And he's intentionally using that language of the Son of Man for his coming to take his hearers' minds to Daniel 7. But in this, we get another time frame reference, do we not? There's a time frame reference in this. That they will not go out throughout all of the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Who's he talking to? You? First century disciple, right? The Son of Man was to come before the disciples finished going through the cities of Israel with the gospel. Now, this is not in contradiction of the gospel being preached to the nations before the Son of Man would come. Since the gospel being preached to the whole world or nations did not mean to every single city in the world, it did not mean to every single individual in the world. So here we have another time frame reference, though. Before you guys go through the whole city, all the cities of Israel, the Son of Man would come. So we have another time frame reference. Let's look at another one. Matthew 16. that one there too, just like Matthew 24, prevents it from being in our time. It would happen before the disciples would finish going through the cities. Matthew 16, verse 28. Jesus says, "Verily I say to you, there will be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom."
I always wondered about that.
Well, me too, until I learned the position I hold now, you know. But it's another time frame reference, right? He says, there's some standing here. Who's he talking to? His disciples, right? Some standing here which shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. I'm sorry, I'm reading. This is another one here that prevents it from being in our time. So when the New Testament writers were writing that it was soon, was at hand, would they be right? That before they died, that's what Jesus said. Some of you standing here wouldn't even taste death until I came. It was imminent in the first century. They expected it to happen then, and it did. And they weren't deceived or mistaken. And Jesus spoke very plainly and clearly about his coming within their lifetime. The only way, this is what I think I mentioned to you earlier on the phone, Zach. The only way we could make this read anything other than the way it reads plainly is if our theology makes us read it the opposite of what it actually reads. If your theology is to have a theology that is contrary to what the Lord plainly said. He plainly said that some of you standing here won't taste death until the Son of Man comes. So, are we trying to change the meaning of the clear text to fit our theology? That's one of the things that we must never do. Remember at the outset of this study, I think week 1, I said we must lay aside our presuppositions. When we're coming to the text, we got to lay aside our presuppositions and then come to the text. And what do I mean by that? I mean we've been raised in a mainly dispensational evangelical culture today. And we must let the text speak for itself. An absolute rule of hermeneutics is what they call the analogy of faith. And what that is Scripture interprets itself. Sacred Scripture interprets itself. I don't need there's typically when you come to anything in here, you can find something else that helps you interpret that. And we definitely need that when it comes to eschatology, right? Let the Scriptures speak for themselves. So when Jesus said, "I come quickly," those standing here won't taste death until they see it. You will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. Those that pierced him will see it. The plain reading and meaning is exactly what he said. And if our theology makes it the opposite of what it said, I think we should trash our theology. And I believe that with any theology that any of us hold on anything, not just eschatology. If we come to the text with our theology that changes what the words actually plainly, clearly say, we ought to get rid of that theology.
Yeah, because that meaning makes a lot more sense, man.
Well, I know some of the other ones, I'm about to deal with them. Some take this passage in Matthew 16 to mean his transfiguration. Some say this is what it's talking about, is his transfiguration. And I actually think it's kind of comical. That interpretation is kind of comical. Here's why. Look at Matthew 17 and verse 1. And after 6 days, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, his brother, and brings them up into a high mountain apart, and was transfigured before them, and his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. It was 6 days later. You telling me Jesus meant some of you will still be alive in 6 days? Well, if that was a meaning, which I know it's not, but all of them were still alive in 6 days. Not just some of them, all of them were still alive in 6 days. And the first one to die was Judas, right? And Judas didn't die until after the crucifixion. So, the position, I believe the position that this meant his coming in judgment in 70 AD is the correct position because it makes the most sense. There is another position on this though. I don't have a huge problem with it, but I don't think it's right either. And it's he's talking about his coming in his kingdom at Pentecost. Sproul, when we watched that video last night, actually just said, I showed her, we were watching the video from Sproul, Last Days According to Jesus, and I knew he was about to go there, so I showed her my notes real fast. Like, I'm just showing it so you know I didn't steal this from Sproul for today. But Sproul, he says, it's 6 days until the Transfiguration. But also, if you're talking about his ascension or Pentecost, you're talking about a few months. From this time to that time, you're only talking about a few months. So it wouldn't be like that big a deal that, you're still going to be alive in a few months. Like I said, I don't have a huge problem with that. It's obviously not talking about his transfiguration because that's not him coming in his kingdom anyways. But I do believe it's his coming in 70 AD because it uses the Son of Man terminology here, which is the same terminology used in Matthew 24 that would happen in the destruction of Jerusalem. So I think we can clearly see that those in Jesus' day would see his coming. It was to happen very soon, quickly, and some of them would still be alive when it happened. All of this is clear from the text of Scripture. So we see the time frame there, right? We saw the time frame. It was soon, and it was quick. It was at hand. We saw things that showed that the coming of the Son of Man had to happen within the lifetime of those people there. That there's no way that it could happen today. That it prevented it. The time frame we saw prevented it from happening today. It happened in that first century. So now we're going to see the scope of this coming. We see the time frame of his coming, which was quick, soon, at hand. Now the scope of his coming. So what does it mean when he's coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory? There's no way this happened, right? This couldn't happen. We would have missed this, right? Well, let me remind you, when we're speaking about on eschatology, we should be coming from a position that we recognize that most, if not all, of it was spoken before the time of the establishment of the New Testament. So when we come to eschatology, most, if not all, is just quoting Old Testament stuff and bringing it forward. Most of it was taken directly from the Old Covenant. This coming in the clouds was not a new idea for the disciples that Jesus was talking to. Remember, he was talking to his disciples. And just like it says in Revelation 1:7, that he was going to come on the clouds, and those that pierced him would see him. So it was not a new idea. They would understand when he said the Son of Man, who he was referencing also. So they would understand coming on the clouds. They would understand Son of Man points them to Daniel chapter 7 as the one that comes to the Ancient of Days. They would know that the Son of Man coming on clouds was taken from Daniel. But not only that, they would know coming in the clouds was judgment language that God used when he judged nations. And not only was it judgment language, but it was also salvific language as well. When he came in the clouds, he came in judgment of one nation and or in salvation of his people. Let's go back and see some of this. This is kind of cool stuff here. Exodus 16. Exodus 16:7. That's in the Old Testament, right after Genesis. If you made it to Revelation, you went too far. Exodus 16:7. And in the morning, then you shall see the glory of the Lord. That's great, right? For that he heareth your murmurings against the Lord. And what are we that we murmur against him? Or what are we that you murmur against us? And Moses said, this shall be, when the Lord shall give you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full. For that the Lord heareth your murmurings, which ye murmur against him. And what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against the Lord. And Moses spoke unto Aaron, saying, say unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he hath heard your murmurings. And it came to pass, as Aaron spake unto the whole congregation of the children of Israel, that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. I tell you, you're affected by culture a lot. When you read Aaron, you want to say Aaron. Y'all familiar with this though? This story? The glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. And this is what's called the Shekinah cloud. This, I don't know if y'all know that imagery that's used. The Shekinah cloud of glory. That's what this is talking about here. Let me ask you this. Did they see God physically here? Or did they see a cloud? Yeah. They saw a cloud. They didn't see God physically. And this cloud, we know, separated the Jews from the Egyptians, right? So there was judgment and there was salvation. Here's another one. Turn up to chapter 24. In verse 9. Exodus 24:9. Then went up Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. And they saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, paved work of a sapphire stone. And as it were, the body of heaven in his clearness. And upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand. Also they saw God, and did eat and drink. And the Lord said unto Moses, come up to me in the mount, and be there. And I will give thee tables of stone, and a law, and commandments, which I have written, that thou mayest teach them. And Moses rose up, and his minister Joshua. And Moses went up into the mount of God, and he said unto the elders, tarry ye here for us, until we come again unto you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man have any matters to do, let him come unto them. And Moses went up into the mount, and a cloud covered the mount. And the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai. And the cloud covered it 6 days, and the seventh day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And the sight of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mount in the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moses went into the midst of the cloud, and gat him up into the mount. And Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. I want to go in that cloud. Isn't that an awesome scene though? Can you picture that scene there? On Mount Sinai, the cloud comes down and has burning fire coming out of the cloud. And then Moses walks into it. This is the same idea here. The Shekinah cloud. This cloud of the glory of God. Let me ask you this. Did they literally see God? Turn to Exodus 33. It said they saw God there, but let me show you this. We can see this in the New Covenant too, but Exodus 33:20. This is God speaking to Moses. Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. So guess what? They didn't see God there. is they saw God there, they're dead. Jesus repeats in the New Covenant, well, I'm sure we're familiar with it, no man has seen God at any time. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father, right? Let's look at one more up here. Exodus 40. These clouds. Exodus 40, verse 34. Exodus 40, verse 34. Then a cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter into the tent of the congregation because the cloud abode thereon, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And when the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the children of Israel went onward in all their journeys. But if the cloud were not taken up, then they journeyed not till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was upon the tabernacle by day, and fire on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. So this cloud language was very common to the Israelites. And it was with them until, turn to Ezekiel. Ezekiel 11. Now there's times the Shekinah cloud had departed and come back and departed and come back. But this is the last time. Ezekiel 11:22. Then did the cherubim lift up their wings, and the wheels beside them, and the glory of God of Israel was over them above. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood upon a mountain which is the east side of the city. It left. The glory of the Lord up and left the city. And I've mentioned this many, many times in our study on eschatology. It headed east, and to the mount that there was Mount Olive. So it left the city, headed east to Mount Olive. And the Shekinah cloud did not come back to the city. It did not come back to the temple. It did not come back to Israel. It left. Until the incarnation. The Shekinah cloud was the presence of God in the midst of His people. And sometimes in the judgment of nations. The Shekinah cloud, the glory cloud, as I said, when it left the temple there, we get that same picture of Jesus as the Shekinah cloud. That the Shekinah cloud, all it was doing was pointing to Jesus, who was what? God with us. When the Shekinah cloud was there, they said God was with us. Then Jesus is born, Matthew 1:23, I think it is, where he says, his name is Emmanuel, meaning God with us. Now He's with us. It says in John chapter 1 and verse 14, the Word became flesh. Y'all know that verse? And dwelt among us. And it says, and we beheld His glory. The same thing. It's called the Shekinah cloud of glory. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It tabernacled among us. That's what that word means. When Jesus came and took on flesh, God tabernacled among us, and we beheld His glory. So in the incarnation, we have that. He's the fulfillment of it. So the Shekinah cloud was the presence of God in the midst of His people, and sometimes in the judgment of nations, as we know happened with the Egyptians. Let's see some other times of judgment, though. Turn to Zephaniah. This is my phone today. It's only like 3 chapters, so you can turn past it. Zephaniah 1. In verse 15. A day of wrath is that day, a day of trouble and distress, a day of destruction and desolation, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. This here It sounds like it's talking about 70 AD, right? You know, it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC by the Babylonians. Same type of language, right? Same type of language we see in the New Covenant. About 70 AD is the same type of language right here. And it says, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Turn to Isaiah chapter 19. Verse 1. The burden of Egypt. Behold, the Lord rides upon a swift cloud. Does that sound familiar? And shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence. And the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight every one against his brother, and every one against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. You see the same language, right? What's this a destruction of? Egypt. That same language, that cloud, riding on a swift cloud to do what? To destroy Egypt. Sounds just like Matthew 24 though. So the same language as Matthew 24. And it's the same language used by Jesus in there. It's not literally coming down from heaven and standing on the earth, but a coming in judgment. That's what he's talking about in Matthew 24. Which also meant he was coming in salvation. That's why I said when we see this language, it's in judgment and it's in salvation. In 70 AD, it was in judgment and salvation. Not salvation in the sense, when I say salvation there, you might be thinking of like soul salvation. I'm talking about salvation of the early Christians from being murdered by the Jews and the Romans. God destroyed that right there and dispersed Christians all over the whole world with what? The gospel. So now the glory of the Lord fills all of the earth, right? It's not just the temple anymore. When we see a small glimpse into heaven before the destruction of Jerusalem in Revelation, we actually see some of this. Turn to Revelation chapter 6. I know I've got a lot of verses. I didn't know if I was going to get through it all, but I'm close to getting through it all. So. Revelation 6, 1. Except for I put a whole chapter right here. Chapter 6, verse 1. And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard, as it were, the noise of thunder, one of the four beasts saying, Come and see. And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on it had a bow. That'll take us till after the flood. The Noahic covenant, right? He had a bow, and a crown was given unto him. And he went forth conquering and to conquer. And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, Come and see. And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword. And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, Come and see. And behold, and lo, a black horse. And he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts saying, A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. And see, thou hurt not the oil in the wine. And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, Come and see. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. This is what we see in Matthew chapter 24, this whole section I'm reading right here. And when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar, this is the point here, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. These are the first century Christians. They were there. They were in heaven. They were dead. And in verse 10, And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? we see a little picture of that, right? That these early Christians were getting martyred. And they're there. The souls that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony that they held. And they're saying, how long, O Lord, until this salvation happens, until the church spreads, gets out of here, and goes forth with the gospel. You could read the rest of the chapter, and it sounds almost exactly like Matthew 24. So we see the saints crying out in verse 10, and when Jesus came in judgment in 70 AD, using the Romans as his axe, he brought about salvation for the early Christians. Salvation from that evil and perverse generation. Destroying the temple and showing that there was no more sacrifice for sin. The glory had left Israel in judgment, but had came to reside in his people, the church, his bride. That's what we see in the new covenant. That's what we saw in John chapter 1 and verse 14, where he says, and the word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we beheld his glory, as of the only begotten of the Father. And in Revelation, actually just turn up to Revelation 21. And I'm about to close this. Revelation 21:1. That glory cloud that left Israel. That glory cloud that left the temple before God destroyed the temple. And then came in the incarnation as Christ. And then left the temple again. And destroyed that temple again. And now what happens here? Revelation 21:1. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city. What's the holy city? Jerusalem. New Jerusalem. Saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven. Or is that the heavenly Jerusalem, right? Well, the writer of Hebrews says that we came to the heavenly Jerusalem. We're not there yet. We're not dealing with this text yet. I'm just mentioning that. Prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. So, who's the New Jerusalem? It's the bride of Christ, which is what? Us. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men. And he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. And God himself shall be with them and be their God. You know, Paul quotes this exact same thing in Romans about the church today. This is what this is talking about. It's talking about now. God dwells in the midst of his people now. He is here now in the midst of his people. Obviously, we know, where it says, what people like to misquote, but where 2 or 3 gather together, he's in their midst. But that's actually dealing about church discipline and not just necessarily being a church. But within the new covenant, the old covenant, the Shekinah cloud of glory would come and it would dwell in the tabernacle. And then when they finally built the temple, where the Holy of Holies is where the Shekinah cloud of glory would stay in that Holy of Holies. And that's why you and I couldn't just walk in there in the old covenant. Because God would kill us. That's why they put bells and ropes on the high priest that had to go in there. Just in case he didn't come back out. They could pull him out instead of walking in there to get him. But then what happened when Christ came? I love to say it. When Christ came, he tore the veil. That's what separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place from the most holy place. Is the veil. He tore the veil after his resurrection, right? And like I said, I always say he tore the veil from top to bottom. It wasn't from bottom to top. And he resurrected. The veil was torn. There's no more. There's no more Holy of Holies as a place on earth. We are now that, the church. And now we can approach his throne through Christ, right? This is what we do when we go pray. Whenever we're praying, this is what we're doing. We're entering into the Holy of Holies and coming by the blood of Christ to the throne of God. It's what the Old Covenant priests used to do. You'd have to go to the priest. And this is where the Catholic Church today still does this stuff. But you'd have to go to the priest with your confessions, and then they would pray for you. Now, all of us are priests in the New Testament, right? He's made us kings and priests. Made us a kingdom and priest. So, what we saw in that old covenant, and God destroyed, it was all just a picture to point us to that new covenant, where we get the true fulfillment of all this. So, next time, maybe, probably, we're going to deal with a new heaven and new earth. I think that's the next logical step, especially when you're going through Matthew 24 right there. Let's go back there real quick. I don't have really much else to say about it. I just want to show. After his coming, it says, and he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from the one end of heaven to the other. Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know the summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when you shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the door. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. That's what we've been dealing with. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. So that's probably what we'll be dealing with next time. So let's go ahead and open it up for questions, discussion,